Part 1. The Arrival. It was supposed to be an escape. That's what I told myself the day I signed the papers, the day I packed my things and left the city behind for good. The stress, the noise, the constant feeling of being trapped. I was done with all of it. The cabin, nestled deep in the forest, seemed like the perfect solution. Isolated, quiet, far from the chaos of the world. Just me and the trees, with miles of wilderness between me and anyone else. The cabin wasn't much to look at. An old, weather-beaten structure, worn down by time and the elements. The realtor had mentioned it hadn't been lived in for years, something about the previous owner moving suddenly, leaving most of their belongings behind. But that didn't bother me. It was exactly what I needed: solitude, a place where I could clear my head, write in peace, and forget about everything else. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time unpacking, getting the old fireplace going, and exploring the surrounding woods. There was a small creek nearby, and I found a trail that led deeper into the forest, winding through towering pines and thick underbrush. The air was crisp, the kind of clean you can only find far away from people. I hadn't felt this relaxed in years. But then, as I began to settle into the routine of my new life, small things started happening. At first, they were easy to dismiss. A thud in the middle of the night, probably an animal I thought, something knocking over a loose log outside. Then, the lights would flicker just for a moment. Old wiring, I reasoned, or maybe a loose fuse. But the more time I spent in the cabin, the more I began to notice things I couldn't explain. It started with the noises. Every night, as soon as the sun set and the woods turned black, I'd hear something. Not the normal sounds of the forest. No owls, no wind, no rustling leaves. It was more like a faint scraping somewhere deep inside the walls. At first, I thought it was mice or squirrels, something nesting in the old wood. But the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic, like something was pacing back and forth inside the walls. One night, I decided to track it. I followed the noise, moving from room to room, listening as the faint scraping seemed to move with me, always staying just out of reach. It was as if it was avoiding me, leading me deeper into the cabin, making sure I couldn't pin it down. I searched the whole house, but I never found anything. Just empty walls. Then, the whispers began. I'd be lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, trying to ignore the scraping sounds when I'd hear it. A faint, distant voice. Just a whisper. Too quiet to make out the words, but always there. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe the trees creaking in the cold night air. But the longer I listened, the more certain I became that it wasn't natural. There was a voice, whispering to me from somewhere deep inside the house. One night, the whispering grew louder. I had been lying in bed for hours, unable to sleep, the sound of the pacing and the faint voices gnawing at my nerves. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I threw off the covers and stormed into the living room, determined to find the source of the sound. But the moment I stepped into the room, the whispering stopped. The house was silent again, eerily still, as if it had been waiting for me. That's when I saw it. The floor. One of the old wooden planks was loose, just barely, but enough for me to notice. I hadn't seen it before. It was in a corner, half hidden under an old rug that the previous owner had left behind. But now, in the dim light of the flickering fire, it stood out to me. My heart pounded as I knelt down, fingers trembling as I pried up the plank. It came up easily, revealing a narrow space underneath, just big enough for me to fit my hand through. I reached down, my fingers brushing against something cold and metal. For a moment, I hesitated. Every instinct told me to stop, to put the plank back and walk away. But I didn't. I grabbed hold of the object and pulled it free. It was a small, rusted key. I stared at it for a long moment, my mind racing. What was it for? Why had it been hidden beneath the floor? That's when I noticed something else. There was a faint outline of something etched into the floorboards around where the key had been hidden. It was subtle, almost invisible unless you were looking closely, but it was there. A symbol, twisted, jagged, carved deep into the wood. Suddenly, the whispering returned. Louder this time, more insistent. It filled the room, echoing off the walls, growing louder and louder until it felt like the entire house was shaking with the sound. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. I was left standing in the middle of the room, the key clenched tightly in my hand, my heart racing, my mind spinning. That's when I realized the truth. I wasn't alone in this house. Part 2. The cellar. The key felt heavy in my hand, cold and rough against my skin. I couldn't stop staring at it, the rusted metal gleaming faintly in the dim light of the cabin. The whispering had stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. Thick, oppressive, and charged with something I couldn't quite name. My eyes darted around the room, searching for any movement, any sign that someone was with me. I had never been one to believe in the supernatural, but in that moment, standing there with the key in my hand, I felt a creeping dread settle over me. I was no longer in control. This house had secrets that were clawing their way to the surface, demanding to be uncovered. My mind raced. What could the key open? There was no obvious lock that came to mind, nothing in the house that would match its old, rusted design. But I knew, deep down, that there was something here, something waiting to be found. And then I remembered. The cellar. The realtor had mentioned it briefly when I first bought the place. He told me the door had been locked for years, that the previous owner had never used it. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. After all, it was just a cellar, probably full of old tools and dusty storage. But now, the thought of it sent a chill through me. Why would anyone lock a cellar and leave it that way for years? My heart pounded as I moved through the house, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. The cellar door was in the kitchen, tucked behind an old pantry, almost hidden from view. I hadn't paid it much attention before, but now it felt like it was waiting for me. I approached the door slowly, my hand shaking as I held the key up to the rusted lock. It was a perfect fit. The key slid into place with a soft click, and the door creaked open with a groan that echoed through the empty house. The smell hit me immediately, stale, damp air that reeked of something long forgotten. I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob, but I knew there was no turning back now. Whatever was hidden down there, I had to know. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into the darkness. The light from the kitchen above faded quickly, swallowed by the black void below. I fumbled for my phone, switching on the flashlight to illuminate the narrow, crumbling steps beneath me. The cellar was far larger than I had expected. The walls were lined with old stone, the floor uneven and covered in dust and dirt that had collected over the years. Rusted tools hung from the walls, their edges dull and worn. A workbench sat against one wall, cluttered with cobweb-covered jars and unrecognizable bits of machinery. But it was what lay in the far corner of the room that stopped me cold. A door. It was small, barely more than 4 feet tall, its wooden frame warped and cracked with age. Unlike the cellar door, this one was different, older, more deliberate. Strange symbols were carved into the wood, twisted and jagged, just like the one I had seen etched into the floor upstairs. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening as I approached the door. Something about it felt wrong, like it was out of place, like it didn't belong here or anywhere. The symbols seemed to writhe and shift under the beam of my flashlight, their shapes twisting into grotesque, almost human forms. My hand shook as I reached for the handle. It was cold to the touch, freezing, like it had been buried in ice for centuries. I pulled, and the door creaked open with a sound that set my teeth on edge. The room beyond was small, no larger than a closet, but it was filled with something far more disturbing than I could have imagined. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. The walls were covered in old, yellowed papers, newspaper clippings, photographs, pages torn from books, pinned up in a chaotic frenzy. Strings of red yarn connected the clippings in a web-like pattern, stretching from one side of the room to the other. But it was the subject of those clippings that sent a wave of nausea through me. They were all about disappearances. I scanned the papers, my heart pounding as I read the headlines. Local man vanishes without a trace. Family disappears from remote cabin, no leads. Another mysterious disappearance baffles authorities. Each article was dated years apart, some from decades ago, others more recent. But they all had one thing in common. The disappearances had all happened near this forest, near this house. My hands shook as I pulled one of the clippings from the wall, reading the details of the case. It was disturbingly similar to what I had experienced. A man had moved into a cabin in the forest, seeking solitude. But after a few months, his friends and family reported him missing. No trace of him was ever found. The article mentioned strange occurrences in the days leading up to his disappearance. Noises in the night, mysterious whispers, the feeling of being watched. Just like me, I stumbled back, my mind racing. Was this why the house had been abandoned? Had the previous owner experienced the same things? The thought chilled me to my core. This place, it wasn't just a house. It was something far darker, far more dangerous. That's when I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound from behind me. I spun around, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The cellar was empty. I was alone, but the sound persisted, growing louder, more insistent, like something was moving through the shadows, just out of sight. I backed away from the door, my heart racing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air growing thick with an oppressive weight. I needed to get out. I needed to get back upstairs. But as I reached the base of the stairs, the door above me slammed shut. The sound echoed through the cellar like a gunshot, and I froze, my pulse racing. I rushed up the steps, slamming my fist against the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked from the outside, and then, from somewhere deep within the cellar, I heard it. A whisper. "Let me out." Part 3. The locked door. My blood ran cold. The whisper, soft, chilling, unmistakable, echoed through the cellar, reverberating off the stone walls and sinking into my bones. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest as I searched the shadows for any sign of movement. The air was thick, suffocating, and the dim beam of my flashlight seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, barely illuminating the edges of the room. "Let me out." The voice whispered again, closer this time. I stumbled back toward the stairs, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The cellar, once just an old, forgotten room, now felt alive with something unseen. The walls, the very air, seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if the house itself was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I slammed my fist against the cellar door, panic rising in my throat. "Let me out," I shouted, but the door remained firmly shut, the rusted lock refusing to budge. I twisted the handle until my knuckles ached, but it was no use. I was trapped down here, with whatever was whispering from the dark. The whisper came again, and this time, it was joined by something worse. A slow, deliberate scraping sound like metal dragging across stone. It was faint at first, barely audible beneath the weight of my own frantic breathing. But as I strained to listen, it grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the far side of the cellar, near the door I had opened, the one with the strange symbols carved into it. My stomach twisted as I realized the scraping wasn't random. It was rhythmic, deliberate, as if something or someone was trying to scratch its way out. I forced myself to move, my legs trembling as I stepped away from the door and edged closer to the center of the room. My flashlight flickered, the beam struggling to cut through the dense shadows that clung to the walls. Every inch of the cellar felt wrong now, like it had shifted into something other. The rusted tools hanging from the walls, the crumbling workbench, the piles of old, forgotten junk. They all seemed to watch me with a silent, predatory intent. I kept my eyes on the door at the far end of the room, the one that had led me to the hidden room full of newspaper clippings and photographs. The door stood ajar, just as I had left it, but now something was different. A faint light flickered from within the room, a sickly yellow glow that hadn't been there before. The scraping sound grew louder. I took a hesitant step forward, my breath catching in my throat. The light from the hidden room pulsed, flickering like a candle about to go out, casting long, jagged shadows across the cellar floor. I could see something moving just beyond the doorway, a shape shifting in the darkness, barely visible but undeniably there. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to get as far away from that room as possible, but something stronger kept pulling me forward. The whisper, the scraping, the unnatural light. They were drawing me in, pulling me closer to whatever was waiting in the shadows. As I neared the door, the light flickered again, and for a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of what was inside. The walls of the hidden room were covered in writing. Long, jagged lines of text scratched into the stone with something sharp, each word twisted and unreadable. The photographs and newspaper clippings that had once been pinned to the walls were gone, replaced by a chaotic swirl of symbols and strange markings. And in the center of the room, barely visible in the flickering light, was a figure. It was hunched over, its back to me, its hands scraping furiously against the floor. The sound, the awful rhythmic scraping, was coming from it. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. It just kept scraping at the floor, its hands working methodically, as though it were trying to dig its way through the stone. And then, as if sensing my gaze, the figure stopped. The cellar fell into a thick, oppressive silence. I stood there, unable to breathe, as the figure slowly turned its head toward me. The light flickered again, casting strange shadows across its face, but I could see it clearly now. It wasn't human. The thing's skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched too tightly over a gaunt, skeletal frame. Its eyes were wide and empty, black pits that seemed to swallow the light. Its mouth, twisted into a grotesque, lipless grin, was filled with jagged, broken teeth. It stared at me for what felt like an eternity, its body completely still, save for its hands, which twitched and scraped at the floor as though they couldn't stop. "Let me out," it whispered again, but this time I could see its mouth moving, the words dripping from its cracked lips like venom. I took a step back, my blood running cold. The thing grinned wider, its eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "You can't leave," it rasped, its voice hollow and grating. "Not until I'm free." Without thinking, I turned and bolted toward the stairs, my legs barely able to carry me as I scrambled up the steps. My hands fumbled at the door handle, twisting it desperately as the whispers grew louder, the thing's voice echoing in my mind. "Let me out." The door wouldn't budge. I banged on it with my fist, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Let me out, please." Behind me, the scraping sound resumed, louder and faster now, as if the thing in the room had been set loose. The air grew colder, thicker, and I could feel the thing's presence moving toward me, inching closer with each passing second. The cellar felt alive, pulsing with a dark, malevolent energy that seeped into my bones. I could hear the thing's breath now, shallow and ragged, as it crawled toward me from the shadows. With one final, desperate surge of strength, I slammed my shoulder into the door. There was a loud crack, and the lock gave way. I burst through the door and slammed it shut behind me, my heart racing, my body shaking with fear. The cellar was silent again, but the whispering, it wasn't gone. It was in the walls now, in the floorboards, in the very air of the house. And it was growing louder. Part 4. The House Wakes. I collapsed against the door, my heart pounding in my chest, gasping for breath. The quiet that filled the kitchen now felt wrong, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to slip up. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for any sound from the cellar, but there was only silence, the kind that wrapped around you, sinking deep into your bones. But I knew the silence was a lie. The whispering hadn't stopped. It had just moved. I staggered away from the door, my mind racing. Whatever had been in that hidden room was still down there, trapped or maybe waiting. I didn't know what it wanted, but I could feel its presence lingering in the house, growing stronger, like a storm brewing just beneath the surface. The key I'd found still weighed heavy in my pocket. My fingers brushed against it, and the cold metal sent a jolt through me. There was something wrong with it, something that had felt off the moment I pulled it from beneath the floorboards. The key wasn't just a tool. It was connected to this house in ways I couldn't understand. I stumbled into the living room, the room spinning around me. My flashlight was growing dimmer, its beam flickering weakly, barely piercing the gloom. The furniture, old, covered in dust, seemed to loom out of the shadows, their shapes distorted, almost wrong. I sat on the edge of the couch, my head in my hands, trying to make sense of what was happening. The cellar, the voices, the thing in the room, none of it made any sense. I hadn't come here for this. This was supposed to be an escape, a place to breathe. Instead, I was suffocating. And then, slowly, the house began to move. It started with a creak, a soft, barely audible groan, like wood shifting under a great weight. I sat up, my pulse quickening, straining to listen. The creaking grew louder, spreading through the walls, through the floor, as if the house was stretching, waking up from a long sleep. I stood, my eyes darting around the room. The shadows seemed to shift, the dark corners of the house twisting in ways they shouldn't. I took a step toward the window, hoping to find some sense of normalcy outside, but as I reached for the curtains, I froze. The whispering had returned, but this time it wasn't coming from below. It was coming from inside the house. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was still, too still. The light from my flashlight flickered again, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. And then from somewhere deep within the house, I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound. My throat tightened as I realized I wasn't alone anymore. The sound, faint at first like something dragging across the floor, grew louder, more deliberate. It was moving toward me slowly, from the hallway that led to the bedrooms. My legs felt like lead as I took a hesitant step back, my breath shallow and ragged. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I could feel it. Something was there, just beyond the reach of the light, watching me. The shuffling sound stopped. For a moment, the house was silent again, but the oppressive weight of the atmosphere only grew. The shadows deepened, and the air grew colder, as if the house itself was holding something terrible just out of sight. Then the voice came again, louder, more insistent. "Let me out!" I stumbled back, my foot catching on the edge of the coffee table, nearly sending me sprawling. The voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was right here in the walls and the floor, crawling through the very foundation of the house. I turned toward the kitchen, desperate to get out, to find the front door and run as far away from this place as possible. But as I moved, the house groaned again, louder this time, like something massive shifting in its sleep. The walls seemed to close in around me, the once familiar layout warping, twisting into something unfamiliar. The front door was just ahead, but with each step, it seemed to stretch farther away, the hallway elongating like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. My flashlight flickered again, its light barely cutting through the thick, suffocating darkness. Every creak, every groan of the house set my nerves on edge, and with every passing second, I could feel the presence, that thing from the cellar, growing closer. "Let me out!" It rasped again, the voice echoing through the hallway, bouncing off the walls. I reached for the doorknob, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip it. My heart raced as I twisted the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I tugged harder, panic surging through me as the door remained locked, refusing to open. Behind me, the shuffling sound resumed, closer this time. I spun around, my back pressed against the door, my eyes scanning the darkened hallway for any sign of movement. The air was thick with an unbearable tension, the walls groaning under some invisible pressure. I could feel it now. The house was alive. I fumbled with the lock, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Come on," I muttered, my fingers slipping against the cold metal. "Come on!" But no matter how hard I twisted, no matter how desperately I tried, the door wouldn't open. And then I saw it, a figure, barely more than a shadow, emerged from the hallway, moving slowly, deliberately, like it was feeling its way through the darkness. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs too long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. My heart leapt into my throat as I realized what it was. It was the thing from the cellar. The creature stepped closer, its feet dragging across the floor with that same awful scraping sound. Its hollow, black eyes stared straight ahead, unblinking, fixed on me. The twisted grin on its face stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. And as it moved closer, I could hear it breathing. Ragged, shallow breaths like something struggling to stay alive. I backed away, my fingers clawing at the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. The creature paused for a moment, its head tilting to the side as if it were listening. Then it spoke again, its voice a low, guttural rasp. "You can't leave until I'm free." The words sent a wave of terror crashing through me. My legs felt weak, my entire body trembling with fear as the thing took another step forward, its breath rattling in its chest. The air around me grew colder, and I could feel the house shifting again, closing in on me. I was trapped. With nowhere left to go, I turned and ran, not toward the door, but deeper into the house. The floor creaked under my feet, the walls groaning as the house seemed to shift and bend with every step I took. The creature's rasping breath followed me, echoing through the hallways, growing louder, more insistent. I raced toward the back of the house, toward the kitchen, my flashlight flickering wildly. The cabinets rattled, the dishes clattering in the sink as if the house itself was trying to stop me. The floorboards groaned and buckled beneath me, but I kept running, desperate to find some way out. And then, just as I reached the back door, I stopped dead in my tracks. The whispering had returned, but this time it wasn't just a single voice. It was many. Part 5, The Gathering. The voices, once distant and faint, now filled the air around me, whispering from every corner of the house. They overlapped in a chaotic murmur, growing louder, more frantic with each passing second. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat as I tried to make sense of it, tried to understand how it had come to this. The whispers were no longer just words, they were demands. "Let us out. You have to let us out." The sound grew, swelling into a terrifying chorus. It seemed to pulse through the walls, vibrating the floor beneath my feet. I felt the pressure in my skull, a ringing in my ears as if the house was speaking directly to me, through me. And then, in the midst of the noise, I heard it again. That scraping. Behind me, the thing from the cellar was getting closer. I spun around, my eyes darting through the gloom, deliberate heartbeat that had filled the air, pulsing through the very walls of the house. But it was faint now, distant, as though it were coming from somewhere far below. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It wasn't over. The heart, the thing I thought I had destroyed, it wasn't gone. It was still here, somewhere deep within the house, buried beneath the earth. And it was still beating. The tremor came again, stronger this time, shaking the floor beneath my feet. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air growing thick with the smell of rot. The heartbeat grew louder, more insistent, like something waking up from a long, deep sleep. I backed out of the room, my hands shaking, my mind reeling. The cellar was silent again, but I knew that whatever I had done, whatever I had unleashed, was still here, still waiting. I stumbled up the stairs, my legs trembling, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The house felt alive around me now, the walls pulsing in time with the distant heartbeat. I could feel it in the floor, in the air, in every creak of the old wood. The house hadn't let me go. It had never let me go. I rushed to the front door, my heart racing, my hands fumbling with the lock. The door swung open, and I stepped out into the night, the cold air biting at my skin. The forest was still, the wind eerily silent, but the oppressive presence of the house lingered behind me. I ran. I didn't stop until the house was far behind me, the whispers, the heartbeat, fading into the night. But even as I reached the edge of the forest, even as the house disappeared from view, I could still feel it. That faint rhythmic thudding. The heart was still beating, and it was waiting for me to come back. Part 11, The Endless Pulse. I kept running. My feet hit the ground hard, the cold air stinging my lungs, but I didn't care. All that mattered was putting distance between me and that house, between me and the heartbeat that I could still hear echoing in the back of my mind. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape it. The woods around me were dense, the trees towering overhead like black sentinels, their branches twisting in the windless air. The path I had once followed was gone, swallowed by the shadows that seemed to shift and close in behind me, making it impossible to tell how far I had come or where I was going. I tried to focus on anything but the heartbeat. I strained to hear the sound of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the chirp of crickets, the distant howl of an animal. But there was nothing, just that faint, rhythmic thudding. It was as if the entire world had gone still, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I glanced over my shoulder, my heart racing, half expecting to see the house looming behind me, but it was gone, swallowed by the trees. But even though I couldn't see it, I could still feel it. The presence of the house clung to me like a shadow, trailing me no matter how fast or how far I ran. And the heartbeat, it wasn't fading. If anything, it was getting louder, a low, deep thud that reverberated through the air, pulsing in time with my own heartbeat, as if the house had latched onto me and was dragging me back, step by step, beat by beat. I stumbled, my legs aching, my body trembling with exhaustion. I had no idea where I was anymore. The trees seemed to twist and shift around me, disorienting me, making it impossible to know if I was even heading in the right direction. I felt trapped, lost in a labyrinth of shadows that shifted and stretched the farther I went. But still, I pressed on. I had to get away. I had to outrun it. Then I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. A whisper. Come back. It was faint, almost too quiet to hear. But it was there, drifting through the trees, carried on the still air. I stopped dead in my tracks, my pulse pounding in my ears. The whisper came again, louder this time, more insistent. Come back. I spun around, my eyes darting through the trees, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing, just the dark, twisted shapes of the trees and the dense underbrush. No figures, no movement, just the whisper. And the heartbeat. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the heartbeat had grown louder again. The deep, rhythmic thudding now almost in sync with my own panic pulse. It was relentless, beating steadily in the background, a constant reminder that I was never truly free. I turned back to the path, or what I thought was the path, and started moving again, faster this time. The trees seemed to close in around me, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted arms. But I didn't care. I couldn't care. All that mattered was getting away from the whispers, from the heartbeat. But the farther I ran, the louder it grew. It was everywhere now, that deep, rhythmic thudding, vibrating through the ground, through the air, through me. I could feel it in my bones, pulsing through my veins, and no matter how far I went, it followed. The whispers, too, were growing louder, merging with the heartbeat, as if they were both coming from the same source. Come back to us. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It wasn't just a voice I had heard in the house or in the forest. It was my voice. You can't escape us. I stumbled again, tripping over a root, and hit the ground hard. Pain shot through my body, but I forced myself to my feet, adrenaline pushing me forward. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to keep moving. I couldn't stop. If I stopped, it would catch up to me. The heartbeat grew louder. Let us in. My pulse quickened, panic surging through me as I realized what was happening. The house, it wasn't just a place. It was alive, and it was in me. It had marked me the moment I stepped inside. The heart, the whispers, the figures, they weren't trapped in the house anymore. They were part of me now, following me no matter how far I ran, no matter how fast I moved. And they were getting closer. I pushed through the trees, my legs burning with exhaustion, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers were deafening now, blending with the sound of the heartbeat until they were one and the same, a terrible, rhythmic chant that filled my mind, drowning out everything else. You're part of us now. The forest was a blur of shadows and twisted shapes, the trees bending and swaying as if they were alive, reaching for me, guiding me back to the house. I could feel it pulling me, dragging me towards something dark and inevitable. The whispers, the heartbeat, the presence of the house, it was all leading me back. And then, through the trees, I saw it. The house. It was there, standing in the middle of the forest, exactly as it had been before, dark and silent, its windows gleaming faintly in the moonlight. I skidded to a stop, my heart racing, my breath catching in my throat. I hadn't been running away from the house. I had been running toward it the entire time. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and my legs nearly gave out beneath me. I had been tricked. The forest, the whispers, the heartbeat, they had all been pulling me back, leading me in circles, dragging me closer and closer to the one place I had been trying to escape. I was never getting out. I stumbled forward, my legs trembling, my mind reeling. The front door of the house stood open, swaying gently in the breeze, as if it were waiting for me. The air around it was thick with the scent of decay, and the faint sound of the heartbeat pulsed through the ground, vibrating beneath my feet. I couldn't go back. I wouldn't go back, but I had no choice. I took a hesitant step toward the house, my body trembling with fear. The whispers were louder now, almost screaming in my ears, and the heartbeat, the relentless, rhythmic pulse, was in perfect sync with my own. The house was waiting, and so was the heart. With one final breath, I stepped inside. Part 12, back where it began. The moment I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me, sealing me in with the darkness. The house was suffocatingly still, as if it had been holding its breath, waiting for my return. The air was thick with decay, that same sickly sweet scent that clung to everything, wrapping around me like a shroud. And then came the heartbeat. It wasn't faint anymore. It thudded loudly, a slow, deliberate pounding that echoed through the walls, vibrating through the floorboards, and rattling in my chest. It was alive again. It had been waiting for me, and now that I was here, it was letting me know that it was in control. I stood frozen in the entryway, my breath coming in shallow gasps as the weight of the house pressed down on me from all sides. I could hear the faint whisper of wind outside, but it was distant, muffled. The world beyond the house seemed far away, unreachable, as though the house had cut me off from it completely. I took a step forward, my feet creaking on the old wooden floorboards. The walls around me were covered in the familiar symbols, twisted, jagged carvings that seemed to writhe in the dim light, just as they had before. But this time, they were glowing faintly, pulsing in time with the heartbeat. Each beat sent a ripple through the walls, as though the house itself was alive, breathing with me. The whispers started again, faint at first but growing louder as I moved deeper into the house. "Welcome back!" The voice slithered through the air, sending a cold shiver down my spine. It was familiar, but not in the comforting sense. It was the same voice that had lured me in before, the one that had spoken through the walls, through the heart. "You've always belonged here." I reached the center of the living room, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of movement, but the house was still. The shadows seemed to stretch longer now, crawling along the walls like living things, shifting and twisting with each flicker of the dim light. My pulse quickened as I realized something was different. The house was the same, but it wasn't. The layout had changed, the furniture had shifted, the rooms fell off. It was as though the house had rearranged itself while I was gone, subtly warping into something more twisted, more dangerous. The heartbeat grew louder, pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. I turned toward the cellar door, which stood open at the far end of the hallway, the faint glow of light spilling out from the stairs below. My heart sank. I knew where this was going. The heart, the thing I thought I had destroyed, was still down there, waiting for me. I had no choice. My legs trembled as I made my way toward the cellar, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air grew colder, and the whispers followed me, louder now, more insistent. "Come closer." "You can't run. Let us out." I reached the top of the cellar stairs, my hand gripping the banister, so tightly my knuckles turned white. The light from below flickered, casting long shadows that danced along the walls, and I could hear the faint sound of scraping coming from somewhere deep below. That familiar, sickening sound, the same one I had heard when I first opened the cellar door. The sound of someone trying to get out. I descended the stairs slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, the heartbeat growing louder with every step. The cellar was the same, dark, damp, and cluttered with old, rusted tools and forgotten junk. But there was something else now, something waiting for me in the darkness. The door at the far end of the cellar was closed. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, my breath catching in my throat. The door was the same one that had led to the heart, the same door that had opened to that terrible chamber filled with bones and whispers. And now it was closed again, as though the house had sealed it shut, waiting for me to open it once more. The heartbeat pounded in my ears, louder than ever, and the whispers grew frantic. "Let us out. Come closer. You can't escape." I stepped toward the door, my hands shaking, my body trembling with fear. The walls of the cellar seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing darker, more twisted. The heartbeat thudded louder, faster, echoing through the floor, through the walls, through me. With a trembling hand, I reached for the door handle. The moment my fingers touched the cold metal, the whispers fell silent. The house grew still. The only sound was the heartbeat, slow and deliberate, pulsing through the door like a living thing. My hand hovered over the handle, my mind racing with doubt and fear, but I knew I had no choice. This was what the house wanted. This was what had been waiting for me all along. I twisted the handle, and the door creaked open. The room beyond was dark, just as it had been before. The same stone walls, the same uneven floor, the same heavy, oppressive air. But the heart was gone. The chamber that had once held the pulsating, monstrous thing was empty, save for a faint, rhythmic glow emanating from the center of the room. I stepped inside. The glow grew brighter as I approached the center of the room, where the heart had once sat. The bones that had surrounded it were gone, the circle of symbols erased. All that remained was the faint, pulsing light, growing stronger with every beat. I stood there, staring at the spot where the heart had been, my mind reeling. The light pulsed in time with the heartbeat, as though the house itself was still alive, still watching, still waiting. Then I heard it, a voice. Not a whisper this time, but a voice. My voice. "You can't leave." I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat, my heart racing with fear. There, standing in the doorway, was me. The figure looked exactly like me. Same face, same clothes, same everything, but there was something horribly wrong. Its eyes were dark, empty pits, its skin pale and gaunt, and its mouth twisted into a sick, mocking grin. "You're part of this now," it said, stepping forward, its voice dripping with malice. "You always were." My blood ran cold. I backed away, my heart slamming against my ribs, but the figure kept coming, its grin widening as it advanced. "You thought you could escape, didn't you?" It sneered, its voice growing louder. "But you belong to the house now." The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pulsing in time with the heartbeat. The light flickered, casting strange shadows that twisted and stretched along the floor, and the air grew heavy with the stench of rot. I tried to speak, but no words came out. My throat tightened, my mind racing, but the figure just kept coming, its hollow eyes locked onto mine, its grin stretching impossibly wide. "You should have never come back," it hissed, stepping closer. "You'll never leave now." The room trembled, the heartbeat growing faster, louder, until it was all I could hear, drowning out everything else. And then the figure reached for me. I stumbled back, my legs giving out beneath me, but the figure grabbed hold of me, its cold, bony fingers digging into my skin. "You're part of us now," it whispered, its breath hot against my ear. "You always have been." The heartbeat reached a fever pitch, pounding in my skull, and the room around me began to spin, the walls twisting and warping as the darkness closed in. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the heartbeat. And then everything went black. Part 13. The final beat. The darkness was complete. It wrapped around me like a blanket of suffocating silence, and I couldn't feel my body anymore. I wasn't sure if I was alive or if I had slipped into something else entirely, a place where time didn't exist, where reality had dissolved into nothingness. The heartbeat was gone. I drifted in the void, my mind spiraling as I tried to piece together what had happened. The house, the whispers, the figure that looked like me, all of it had led me here, to this endless abyss. I had thought I could escape, thought that maybe I could outrun whatever haunted that place. But the truth had been staring me in the face all along. There was no escape. The house had taken me, and now I was part of it. But as I floated in the dark, something began to change. A faint sound, so soft I almost didn't hear it, crept through the silence. It was a slow, rhythmic thud. The heartbeat. It was back, faint and distant, but growing louder with each passing moment. I opened my eyes if they were still mine. I wasn't in the chamber anymore. I wasn't in the house. I was somewhere else, and yet the house was with me. I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive, wrapped around me like a shroud. I tried to move, but my body didn't respond. Then I saw it. The light. It flickered faintly in the distance, just as it had in the heart chamber, pulsing in time with the heartbeat. The glow illuminated my surroundings, revealing jagged, twisted shapes that stretched out in every direction, like the roots of some ancient gnarled tree. The walls were alive, pulsing with the same rhythm as the heartbeat, their surfaces covered in those same twisted symbols I had seen throughout the house. I realized with a sinking feeling that I was inside something. Inside the house. Inside the heart. The light grew brighter, casting long, distorted shadows across the ground. And as I looked around, I saw them. The figures. Dozens of them, pale and twisted, their hollow eyes fixed on me as they swayed in the flickering light. Their bodies were grotesque, their limbs unnaturally long, their mouths twisted into hideous, mocking grins. They were waiting for me. "You're part of us now," one of the figures whispered, its voice slithering through the air. "You always have been." The others joined in, their voices merging into a low, insistent chant. "Let us out! Let us out!" I stumbled back, my legs trembling as I tried to distance myself from them, but the walls, alive and pulsing, seemed to shift around me, cutting off any means of escape. The ground beneath me trembled, and I could feel the heartbeat deep within the earth, growing stronger, more insistent. "You can't run from us," another figure hissed, stepping closer. Its grin widened, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "We're inside you now." I tried to speak, but my voice was gone. My mouth moved, but no sound came out. The figures closed in around me, their hollow eyes gleaming with malice, their whispers growing louder, drowning out the thudding of the heartbeat. The room, the world around me, began to close in. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the shadows twisted and writhed along the walls like living things. I could feel the house pulling me deeper, dragging me down into its endless nightmare, but I couldn't fight it. I was too weak, too far gone. The figures circled me, their voices growing more frantic, more desperate. "Let us out. Free us. You belong to us." And then, through the chaos, I saw it. The heart. It was back, looming over me, pulsating with that same rhythmic beat that echoed through the walls, through the floor, through my body. The black, twisted tendrils that stretched out from it twitched and writhed, reaching for me, drawing me closer. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The figures were everywhere now, their whispers filling the air, their cold, skeletal hands reaching out to grab me, pull me into the darkness with them. The heart beat faster, its tendrils twitching in anticipation. "You can't escape," the figure that wore my face whispered, stepping out of the shadows. Its eyes gleamed with that terrible, mocking light, its grin wide and cruel. "You never could." I shook my head, panic rising in my chest. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But the heartbeat, thudded louder, faster, until it was all I could hear, drowning out the whispers, the figures, the very sound of my own thoughts. The heart wanted me. It had always wanted me. And now it was taking me. The figures lunged, their bony fingers wrapping around my arms, my legs, pulling me toward the heart. I tried to fight, tried to resist, but they were too strong. The ground shifted beneath me, the walls closed in, and I was dragged toward the heart, its black tendrils reaching out to engulf me. "You're one of us now," the figures whispered, their voices echoing in my mind. "You always have been." The tendrils wrapped around my body, pulling me closer to the heart, their cold, slimy touch sending a wave of nausea through me. The heartbeat reached a fever pitch, pounding in my skull, rattling through my bones, until I thought I would be torn apart by the sound alone. And then, just as the tendrils tightened their grip, pulling me into the heart, I felt it. Pain. A sharp, searing pain shot through my chest, cutting through the noise, the whispers, the chaos. My vision blurred, my body convulsed, and for a moment I thought I was dying. But the pain, it wasn't from the heart. It was from me. Something inside me was fighting back. Something deep within me, something I had thought was lost, was still there. And it was fighting to survive. The heartbeat faltered. The tendrils twitched, loosening their grip, and the figures recoiled, their hollow eyes widening in surprise. I gasped, my breath ragged, my heart pounding in my chest. The pain intensified, but I forced myself to stand, to push against the weight of the heart, the figures, the house itself. "You don't belong here," I whispered, my voice weak but defiant. The heartbeat faltered again, stuttering, as though the heart itself was unsure of what was happening. The figures shrieked, their twisted forms collapsing in on themselves, their whispers dissolving into the air. I stumbled forward, my body trembling, my vision blurring as I reached out toward the heart. The pain in my chest grew unbearable, but I pushed through it, focusing on one thought: I will not be part of this. With one final surge of strength, I plunged my hand into the heart. The world around me exploded. The heartbeat stopped. The figures screamed, and everything went black. Part 14. Out of the dark. The darkness felt different this time. It wasn't the suffocating, crushing void that had swallowed me before. It was empty, quiet. For the first time since I had entered the house, there was no heartbeat, no whispers, just silence. I floated in the stillness, weightless, my body numb from the pain I had endured. I wasn't sure if I was alive or dead, or if this was some liminal space between the two. But as I drifted, something began to change. A faint, soft light pierced the darkness, distant at first, but growing brighter with each passing second. The light was warm. It was pulling me toward it, beckoning me with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in so long. It felt like the first breath of air after drowning, the first glimpse of the sun after being lost in the dark for days. I reached for it, my fingers trembling, and the moment I touched it, the world around me shifted. I was no longer floating. I could feel the ground beneath my feet, solid and real. The air was cool and fresh, and I could smell the faint scent of pine and damp earth. Slowly, I opened my eyes. I was standing in the forest. The same forest that had surrounded the house, the same twisted trees, their branches tangled like gnarled fingers. But this time it was different. The air wasn't thick with the stench of decay. The oppressive weight that had hung over everything was gone, replaced by a calm stillness. I turned, half expecting to see the house looming behind me. But it was gone. The clearing where it had stood was empty, overgrown with weeds and wildflowers, as if the house had never existed at all. A wave of relief washed over me, and I stumbled forward, my legs weak and trembling, but my heart lighter than it had been in what felt like an eternity. I was free. The heart, the figures, the house, they were all gone. I had survived, but as I walked through the clearing, something gnawed at the back of my mind. I had felt the pain, the searing agony in my chest. I had felt the tendrils of the heart tightening around me, pulling me in. How had I escaped? How had I pulled myself out of that darkness? I looked down at my hands, expecting to see the scars of the ordeal. But they were clean. My skin was smooth, unmarked. It was as if none of it had happened. But it had. I knew it had. I kept walking, my mind racing with the memories of what had happened in that house. The heart, the voices, the twisted figures. They had all tried to pull me in, to make me part of their nightmare. But I had resisted. I had fought back. Yet, as I moved deeper into the forest, the sense of peace that had filled me began to fade. A creeping unease settled in, crawling up my spine. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. The light, once warm and welcoming, grew dimmer, the sky overhead darkening with clouds. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. In the distance, faint but unmistakable, I heard it. The heartbeat. Slow, rhythmic, deliberate. Thud, thud, thud. It was faint, barely more than a murmur, but it was there. I could feel it vibrating through the ground, pulsing through the air. My stomach twisted with dread. I spun around, my eyes scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches creaking softly, but there was no one there. No figures, no voices, just a faint, persistent heartbeat. No, I whispered, my voice trembling. No, this can't be happening. I took a step back, my heart racing in my chest. I had destroyed the heart. I had fought it. I had escaped. But the sound, it was there, deep in the earth, a reminder that I hadn't truly won. The house may have been gone, but the heartbeat had survived. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the forest floor, the sound of the heartbeat growing louder with every step. The trees blurred past me, the shadows lengthening, stretching out like dark tendrils reaching for me. My breath came in ragged gasps, panic rising in my chest as the thudding grew more insistent. Thud, thud, thud. It was chasing me. I could feel it. Whatever force the heart had been, it wasn't gone. It had just moved. It had followed me, latched onto me, waiting for its moment to pull me back into the dark. My legs burned with the effort of running, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let it take me again. I burst through the trees, emerging into a small clearing, and skidded to a halt. In the center of the clearing, standing alone in the grass, was a door. My heart sank. It was the same door I had seen in the cellar. The same warped wood, the same twisted symbols carved into its surface. The same door that had led me to the heart, to the nightmare. And it was waiting for me. The heartbeat thundered in my ears now, louder, faster, like a drumbeat signaling the end. I backed away, shaking my head, my breath catching in my throat. No, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I won't go back. But the door seemed to pulse with life, the symbols writhing in the dim light, beckoning me closer. The heartbeat echoed through the clearing, a relentless, steady thud that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. I had destroyed the heart. I had escaped the house. But the truth was undeniable. I hadn't escaped at all. The heartbeat wasn't just part of the house. It was part of me. Part 15, forever bound. The door stood in front of me like a monument to the nightmare I thought I had escaped. Its twisted symbols writhed across the warped wood, glowing faintly in the dim light, their shapes shifting like living things. The heartbeat was deafening now, pounding relentlessly in my chest, in the earth, in the air, everywhere. I had run so far. I had fought with everything I had to break free. But standing here, in this clearing, staring at the door, I realized the truth that had been hiding in plain sight. I was never meant to leave. The heartbeat wasn't just coming from the ground, from the air, or from the door. It was inside me. The house, the heart, the voices. All of it had become part of me the moment I stepped into that cursed place. The figures, the whispers, the heart itself had all tried to tell me, and I had ignored the signs. I had fought it, but I had never truly won. I was bound to this now. Bound to the house, bound to whatever dark force lived in its walls, in its foundations. It had claimed me, and I could feel its hold tightening, squeezing the last bit of resistance from me as I stood before the door. The wind picked up around me, rustling the leaves of the trees. The branches overhead groaned like the limbs of some ancient creature, and I could almost feel the forest watching me, waiting for what I would do next. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my ears, but the door pulsed with the same rhythmic beat as the heart, calling me closer. The symbols on its surface writhed and shifted, beckoning me, pulling me in. Come back, the whispers called. They were faint at first, barely a murmur, but they grew louder, more insistent. You belong here. The wind howled through the trees, and the shadows seemed to lengthen, creeping toward me like dark tendrils reaching out from the door. The heartbeat grew louder, more forceful, and I felt its pull deep inside my chest. I couldn't resist it anymore. With a trembling hand, I reached for the door, my fingers brushing against the cold, warped wood. The moment I touched it, the symbols flared to life, glowing brightly in the dim light, and the door creaked open with a groan that echoed through the clearing. Behind the door was nothing but darkness. The same yawning void that had swallowed me before. The same endless black that had pulled me into the heart's grip. But this time, I knew there would be no escape. No fight. No second chance. The house had won. I stepped through the doorway, the darkness enveloping me immediately. The air was thick and cold, pressing in from all sides as I moved deeper into the void. The door creaked shut behind me, sealing me inside. And then the whispers returned. "Let us out. Come back. You're one of us now?" The voices surrounded me, their desperate, pleading tones echoing through the endless dark. The heartbeat, slow and deliberate, pulsed through the air, and I could feel it in my bones, in my blood, in every part of me. I was back where I started. The darkness shifted around me, and I saw them. The figures, dozens of them, pale and twisted, their hollow eyes gleaming in the faint light that pulsed through the darkness. They stood in a circle around me, watching, waiting. Their skeletal forms jerked and twitched with each beat of the heart, and I knew that they, too, had once stood where I now stood. They had tried to escape, had tried to fight, but in the end, they had become part of the house. And now so had I. The ground beneath me trembled, the air grew heavier, and the figures stepped closer, their whispers growing louder. "Let us out. You can't escape. You belong here." The walls of the dark space pulsed with the same rhythm as the heartbeat, and I could feel it wrapping around me, pulling me deeper into the house's embrace. The figures reached out for me, their bony hands brushing against my skin, their hollow eyes gleaming with something like triumph. I took one last breath, and then everything went still. The whispers fell silent. The heartbeat slowed, its steady thudding fading into the background, until it was barely more than a faint murmur. And then I understood. I was the house now. I was the heart. I was the whispers in the walls, the figures in the shadows, the beating pulse that would never stop. The house had taken me, consumed me, made me part of its dark, endless cycle. And soon it would call for someone else. The door would open again. The whispers would begin anew. The heartbeat would start to thud louder, pulling them in just like it had pulled me. And when they came, when they crossed the threshold of the house, they would hear the heartbeat, feel the walls closing in, and they would try to escape. But the house always wins, because the house is alive. And now so am I.